Hello, my name is Wolf Kaiser, and next to me is Uma Harano. We both work on the Pro SDK team, and we'll talk about beginning Pro customization, showing Pro extensibility patterns of the SDK today. Just give you a quick overview over what is available through the Pro SDK. Okay, Uma is going to start out, and then I'm going to finish it off. Uma?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to begin with some basic concepts relating to the two main extensibility patterns relating to the Pro SDK, the ArcGIS Pro module add-ins, and the ArcGIS Pro managed configurations. We will learn about the DAML, which is the declarative add-in definition, the module class file, and the configuration manager class file. Wolf will then take it over and dive into the advanced extensibility patterns, such as the ArcGIS Pro CoreHost Application and the Pro plugin DataSource. ArcGIS Pro SDK for .NET extends the Pro application using the .NET framework. There are 4 extensibility patterns available for this: the ArcGIS Pro module add-ins, managed configurations, CoreHost application, and the plugin DataSource. The Pro SDK offers a collection of project and item templates. The SDK is available from the Visual Studio Marketplace. You can download and install it directly from within Visual Studio. We currently support versions 2017 and 2019 of Visual Studio. An important thing I want to mention here is that the Pro API comes with the Pro installation out of the box. They are available in the bin extensions subfolder of the install location. They are all accessed from within Visual Studio as file-based references. There is nothing registered in the global assembly cache. Here are some of the key features and patterns of the Pro SDK. It's built for the 64-bit platform. The .NET framework version that we support currently with the Pro 2.5 release is version 4.8. The UI is written using WPF, which stands for Windows Presentation Foundation. The programming pattern to use is MVVM, which stands for Model View View Model. ArcGIS Pro is a multi-threaded application. So if you extend it using the Pro SDK, you have to work with multiple threads using an asynchronous programming pattern. What is an ArcGIS Pro add-in? It is one of the extensibility patterns used to extend the Pro application. You use an add-in to modify the existing features and functionality of Pro to suit your custom workflow. The screenshot on this slide shows you these type of UI customizations that are possible with the Pro SDK. Notice all these UI elements, the buttons, galleries, dock panes, etc. All these UI elements are extensibility points that you can use in your add-in development. The Pro SDK provides you with item templates for pretty much all these UI elements. In Visual Studio, when you compile an add-in module project, you get a compressed Esri add-in-x file. This gets copied into your user profile documents location. The full path is given here at the bottom of this slide. This is one of the well-known locations from which you can load add-ins from. Pro will load add-ins from. When you work with add-ins, there are 2 main things you begin with: the DAML and the module class file. Add-ins use a declarative framework to define the UI elements. The config.daml file in an add-in is where you define these UI elements. We will learn more about this in the next slide. The module class file in an add-in is the hub and central access point for a subsystem. So if you want to modify anything in a subsystem, you start with its module class. It is very similar to the extension object used in the ArcObjects 10x framework, and it is a singleton instantiated automatically by the Pro framework. Here is some more information about the DAML. The DAML is the declarative markup language that Pro uses to define its UI elements. Here on this slide, you can see a sample code of a config.daml file in an add-in. Notice the simple XML syntax. Your add-in, for example, could create a doc pane, a new tab on Pros ribbon with a group that hosts a collection of controls such as buttons, tools, galleries, etc. All these UI elements are defined in your config.daml file. An important thing I want to mention here is that the DAML can be used to make additions, modifications, and deletions to the Pro UI. Pro also uses DAML to define its UI elements. Pro's DAML files are located in the bin extensions subfolder in the Pro install location. The DAML is transactional and is processed in a sequential manner. There are 3 distinct actions. The insert action, where you insert new UI elements into the Pro's interface. The update action, which allows you to make modifications to the existing UI elements. And the delete action, which allows you to delete UI elements. Notice the code snippet on this slide. The element name determines the action. So here, notice the update module, update group, delete button, and insert button element names. Here at the bottom, you can see the screenshot where we are trying to change the map tab navigate group. Here we're deleting the Pros bookmark button and we're inserting a new toggle button. You will see that in the demo coming up. Here is another example. In this example, I'm modifying the map and the layer context menu on the TOC. In the code snippet, you can see how we're doing that. We're accessing the Esri mapping module using the update module element. And then within the menus group, I am using the update menu element and setting its ref ID attribute to the Esri mapping layer context menu. And then I'm using the insert button element and setting that ref ID attribute to my new button that I want to insert into this context menu. So we're going to see that also in the demo coming up. As I mentioned before, the DAML is transactional and it's processed in a sequential manner. So in many cases, you will want to make UI changes to elements declared in another DAML. So you have an add-in dependency in this situation. To solve this, you use the dependencies tag in your config.daml. The name attribute of the dependency child element is set to the GUID of the add-in you're depending on. In many cases, you can use existing ArcGIS Pro framework elements in your add-in development. So on the screenshot on this slide, notice this custom group defined on Pro's ribbon. It is hosting a button, the bookmark button, which is a Pro UI element. This is accomplished with a code snippet given here. Notice within this group element, there is a button child element and its ref ID is set to the ID of the bookmark button, Esri mapping bookmarks navigate gallery. So in many cases, you will need to know the ID of existing Pro elements. There are 3 ways by which you can get the ID of existing Pro elements. First, on the SDK wiki page, there is an ArcGIS Pro DAML ID reference. The URL for this is given at the top of this slide over here. Next, within Visual Studio, you can install the Pro Generate DAML IDs utility. This allows you to use Visual Studio IntelliSense to find the IDs. And then the last option is my favorite option, the Customize the Ribbon Show IDs option. I'm going to show that in the demo coming up. So in this demo, we're going to see 2 things, how to use the Pro SDK to create an add-in, and we'll also look into some DAML customizations. So here I have Visual Studio 2019. I've already installed the Pro SDK. So I'm going to create a new project, File, New Project. And here in this Create New Project dialog, I'm going to first filter for ArcGIS Pro SDK project types. Here are all the project types available with the SDK, and I'm going to select ArcGIS Pro module add-ins. I'm going to use the default project name and allow Visual Studio to create an add-in module project for us. So here is the add-in project. Notice the Solution Explorer. I'm going to expand the references node, and you can see the references made to the Pro API. These are all files in the bin extensions installation folder. Here is the config.daml and the module class file, just as we saw in the slides. The file open over here is a config.daml. This is where you define your UI elements. Within the add-in info element over here, we can use this to define some metadata information relevant for this add-in. The ID attribute is important. It is set to a GUID that uniquely identifies your add-in. Notice the insert module element over here. This is where you host the new UI controls. The ID attribute is set to the module ID, and the class name attribute is set to the module1 class file. Notice the tabs, groups, and controls that are stubbed out by the project template. These are containers that will host your UI elements. Notice the group child element. It has the appears on add-in tab attribute set to true by default. This is a quick and convenient way by which you can get your UI elements onto the Pros ribbon without creating new tabs. We can see that in the demo coming up. So at this point, I'm going to add a UI element to this project. So I'm going to right-click the project context menu, select Add New Item. I'm going to expand the ArcGIS folder and select ArcGIS Pro Add-ins. You can see all the item templates available by the Pro SDK. You have the UI elements such as your button, combo box, dock pane, all listed over here. Then you select button for this demo, and I'm going to name this button Add-in Demo. The item template has created my Add-in Demo button class file. This is my button, which inherits from Pro's framework button base class. Here is the on-click method override. This is where you would add your custom workflow that you would like to be executed on the button click. And for this demo, to represent my custom workflow, I'm going to make a simple message box that displays a message. Okay. Now back in the config.daml, notice within the controls group, my new add-in demo button is defined over here. Here is the ID attribute for my add-in demo button, and various static aspects of the button such as tooltips, caption, and the image are defined over here. An important attribute here is the class name attribute, which is set to the add-in demo, which is the button class that I just showed you. Now this button is now hosted within this default group using its ref ID. Now I'm going to build this project. Here is my user profile documents folder, and the module compilation has created this GUIDed folder here. The GUID in this folder name matches the GUID that identifies my add-in that I showed you earlier. So when I browse into this folder, you can see the compressed Esri add-in-x file created here. This is our add-in. This is one of the well-known folders from which Pro will load add-ins from. So now back in Visual Studio, I'm going to click the Start button to launch ArcGIS Pro in debug mode. I'm going to initialize Pro with a simple project. Now notice the add-in tab that is created here. This is created by our add-in. And within this tab is a group that hosts my add-in demo button. You click on that and it displays my message box representative of my custom workflow. So this was a quick demo to show you how you could use the SDK to create an add-in. Okay. So I want to show you one more thing. Here I have another add-in project working with DAML. I'm going to show you how you can customize the Pro UI with DAML. The first thing I've done here is I've created a new button, my Toggle Legend button. When you click on this button, it will toggle the visible state of the legend in your TOC for all the layers. So I want to display this button in 3 locations on the Pro UI. I want to show it on the Map tab within the Navigate group and on the Map and the Layer context menu on the TOC, just like we saw in the slide. So the first thing I did is within the Update module element, I set the ref ID attribute to Esri mapping. This is the Pro module that I want to update with my customizations. And then within the groups element, I've used the update group child element and set the ref ID to the Esri mapping navigate group ID. And here, very straightforward, I've used the insert button element, set the ref ID to the ID of my toggle legend button. And I also want to delete a button on the navigate group. So I've used the delete button element name and set the ref ID to the bookmark navigate gallery button that I would like to delete. Next, I would like to add my toggle legend button to 2 context menus on the Pro UI, in the map context menu and the layer context menu. So as you can see, within my menus element, within the update menu child element, I have referenced the map context menu using its ID and set it for the ref ID attribute. Then I've inserted my button, my toggle legend button, using the insert button element. I set the ref ID attribute. Now within the map context menu, I want to specifically add my toggle legend button at next to the add data button. So I've used the place with attribute and set the value to be my add data button. This is Pro's add data button. We'll see that in Pro in a couple of minutes. And similarly, I have also made the same changes to the layer context menu. I've used the insert button element, set the ref ID to my toggle legend button. And in this case, I want to place my toggle legend button next to the symbology button. So let us see how this looks in the Pro UI. So here is Pro. Notice the map tab. Notice my toggle legend button. It's hosted in the navigate group. Also, for reference, here I have an image of a default Pro UI. Notice the bookmark button over here. And you don't see that button in the running version of Pro. I have removed it with my DAML customizations. Now, when I click my toggle legend button, notice that the legend of the layers in the TOC is now not visible. Here is my map context menu. I'm going to access that. And right next to the add data button, you can see the same toggle legend button. So if I click on that, you can see that all the layers in the map have their legends visible now. It toggles the visibility. Similarly, here's a third location that I've hosted my button on. When I right-click my layer context menu, right next to my symbology option here is my toggle legend button. So I click on that and it toggles the visibility of the legend. And the last thing I want to show you here in this demo is I'm going to access Pro's backstage using the project tab. Here in the options page, I'm going to access the customize the ribbon property sheet. Notice the show command IDs on screen tip option. I recommend that you turn this on all the time. And then when you go back to Pro and you hover over any of the buttons or UI elements, you can see the ID, Esri mapping add data button in this case. So this is a quick and easy way by which you can get the IDs of existing Pro UI elements. So to recap, I showed you how you are able to use the SDK to create an add-in. We saw some simple DAML modifications, and going on to the next slide. Configurations. The configuration is another extensibility pattern. It is very similar to an add-in, but it allows you to extend the Pro application in additional ways. It helps you design a version of Pro that represents your organization's brand and your custom workflow. So you can, it includes all the functionality of an add-in, plus the ability to modify the startup experience of Pro, such as change the application title, the icon, the splash screen, start page, and the about page. And it also allows you to make UI customizations at runtime. In Visual Studio, when you compile a managed configuration project, you get a compressed Pro config.x file. This gets placed in your user profile documentation folder. The full path is given here at the bottom. Notice here on this slide the Pro screenshots. On the left, you see the default start page that you're all familiar with. On the right over here is a custom start page that you get out of the box with a managed configuration template. We're going to see that in the demo coming up. You can run a configuration on the command line using the /config argument. You pass in the name of the configuration on the command line, as you can see in this code snippet here, where the Acme configuration is passed to the /config parameter. Multiple configurations can be installed on the machine, but you can only run one configuration per instance of Pro. The important class here is a configuration manager class. It's defined in DAML, and it provides a set of overrides that you can use to customize the startup behavior in Pro. You can implement any of these overrides, and they're all optional. So if you do not want to modify a specific startup behavior on Pro, you can just not implement the callback or return null. So here in the configuration demo, I'm going to show you what you get out of the box with the managed configuration template, and then we're going to modify it further for our specific workflow. So here in Visual Studio, I have a configuration project that I created with the SDK. I've made no changes to it. Here in the Solution Explorer, you can see the config.daml and the module class file, very similar to an add-in. The file open here is the config.daml file. Notice the configuration element. It has a configuration manager child element with a class name attribute set to the code behind file that implements my configuration manager. So we're going to look into that code in a few minutes. But first, I want to show you my UI folder here in the Solution Explorer. It has a series of user control, one for the About page, splash screen, and the Start page. You can simply use these user controls to change the Pro startup behavior, or you can modify them. Okay, so now here is a configuration manager class file. I'm going to go through each one of these callbacks. First, here is my application name property override. You can use this to change the application name displayed on Pro's title bar. Here in this case, the SDK has stubbed out a default for us, Pro Configuration 1. Next, here is the icon property override. Again, you can use this to change the application icon displayed in the title bar. This is the default that is provided by the template. Here is the on-show start page callback. This returns a start page user control to Pro's framework. This is the user control view model, so we are implementing a MVVM pattern over here. The important thing I want to mention here is if you modify Pro's startup page experience, it is your responsibility to initialize Pro with a new project or an existing project. Next, here is my on-show splash screen callback. This returns a new user control, splash screen user control to Pro's framework. And then finally, here is my on-show about page callback. The user control that's returned over here, the about page user control, is injected into Pro's backstage. So at this point, you can add any of the UI item templates like buttons, combo boxes, or dock panes to represent your custom workflow to this project. So I'm going to build this and run this configuration on the debugger. Notice my custom splash screen with my application name Pro Configuration 1. And here is my new start page. Notice the title bar also has the customized application name Pro Configuration 1 and the icon over here. I'm presented with a collection of existing projects, and I can click on one of these projects to initialize a Pro session. Now I can access Pro's Backstage by clicking on the Project tab, and here on the About page, notice the text Pro Configuration 1. This is the About page customization that was done with my configuration project. So now let's stop the debugger, and I want to customize this workflow further. For the purpose of this demo, I want us to assume that we work for an organization that has a geocoding workflow. Our users geocode addresses and parcel IDs. I want to modify Pro's startup experience to reflect this workflow. So I have here is another Visual Studio configuration project. I've already made my geocode user control. So here is my reusable geocode user control. It's very simple. It has a text box where you type in the address that you want to geocode and a find location button. The code behind file for this has all the logic to geocode the location, open up a Pro session, and open a map view to zoom to this location. But this code is not relevant for this demo. Here is my geocode start page. This is the start page that I want Pro to use when it initializes. Notice that I have hosted my geocode user control, my reusable control over here. You can see that in the designer and here in the XAML. So now let us see the changes that I have to make to my configuration manager class file to accomplish this. Here is my onShow start page callback. So now I want to use my new geocode start page. That's the one that I want to return to the Pro framework. So I'm going to change this to return the geocode start page to Pro's framework, and I'm also going to change the view model. So now I also have to change this member variable. So this is the only change I had to make to the template to now display my new geocode start page. So here is my onShow splash screen callback. I'm going to make no changes to this. I've already changed the application name, so that'll be reflected in the splash screen. Here is the onShow about page callback. I want to insert some company-specific copyright information, so I'm going to change this to display my geocode about page. So these are the changes I had to make to now customize my startup experience in Pro. So at this point, to represent my custom workflow, I'm going to add a UI element. I'm going to add a Pro SDK item template. And for this demo, I'm going to add a new doc pane. Let us use the default name. And I'm going to build this configuration. And let's run the configuration. So here is my splash screen with my company name. And this is my new startup page. Notice my geocode user control is hosted here. It's pre-populated with an address. I'm going to go ahead and use that and geocode it. Now a Pro session is being initialized. A map view opens up and zooms to the location that I typed in. And here on the geocode tab, you can see my new doc pane shows up as a representation of my custom workflow. Now, one final thing, when I click the project tab and access the about page, you can see my company specific copyright information is injected over here. So to recap, I showed you two things in this demo. I showed you what you get out of the box with the SDK configuration template, and we modified it further for our custom workflow. So now it's back to Wolf to talk about two additional extensibility patterns. Thank you.
Thank you, Uma. So what Uma just showed us was the two extensibility patterns, the add-in and then the managed configuration that also includes the capability of an add-in. So I'm going to show you two more, the CoreHost application and then also the plugin DataSource. So first, what is the ArcGIS Pro CoreHost application? It's a standalone application that's utilizing a subset of the Pro assemblies. The ArcGIS CoreHost assembly is in essence the API to manage CoreHost functions. The ArcGIS.core assembly includes APIs like the geodatabase and the geometry classes. So CoreHost applications have 64-bit access to geodatabase and also to geometry classes that are used by ArcGIS Pro. It's the identical API, the identical classes. CoreHost applications can either be Windows console applications or WPF applications. You can see a little screenshot representation on the right side of my display. So how do you create an ArcGIS Pro CoreHost application? The easiest is you would use the CoreHost project template for console 64-bit applications. And optionally, you can transfer that into a WPF standalone application. So one caveat here is it's using the COM single-threaded apartment model. That's very important, but as long as you use the template, that's all taken care of for you. Also, on that machine where you run a CoreHost application on, ArcGIS Pro has to be installed and it also has to be licensed. So one last thing you have to take care of before you can use the API is to call host.initialize. On the right side, you see a little screenshot of a template that was created for you by using the CoreHost project template. So you can see everything that you needed was taken care of for you. The single-threaded apartment model has been attributed here to the main function, and host initialize has been stubbed out and inserted for you. So as long as you use the templates, there is very little that you have to do. So that brings us to our first demo, CoreHost. So I used the template and programmed a little sample here. This sample is also available under our community samples GitHub repository. So you can look up the code there if you want to. So again, you can see that the attribution for the main function has been done by our template, by our project template. So this is the single threaded apartment model being configured. And now the other thing that the project template did for me, it called host initialize, which initializes, checks for my licenses and everything, and then initializes my API functionality. However, I commented this out because I implemented this perform CoreHost task function. Let's go to that function. And you can see within that function, I actually call the initialize right there. So once I call initialize, I can now utilize the Pro Core assemblies, including the geodatabase and any kind of geometry operations I want to do. So let's run this real quick. So I'm going to build it first, rebuild. And I'm going to run it in debugger. And it should hit my breakpoint right here. So you can see that it's already initialized itself. So clearly my licensing and everything is okay. I now can use my API, my core API, including I can create a new geodatabase from a geodatabase path that I pass in as a parameter. And once I open that geodatabase, I can now go through all the feature class definitions within that geodatabase. So let's step through the first one here, and you can see, so here's my first definition. I take the feature class definition and I print it out onto the console. So we will see that content printed on the screen. Let's continue. And now you can see, here's my feature classes that are listed, and then within the feature class, I show all the column attributes and the attribution for the columns itself. So that's an example how you could use a CoreHost application. The main purpose of CoreHost would be to perform data loading, data exporting, or any kind of geometry computation that you don't want to run within the context of ArcGIS Pro. Back to the slides. So our next extensibility pattern is the Pro plugin data source. So what is a plugin data source? So we know that Pro supports spatial and tabular data from many data sources and formats. File-based data such as shapefiles, file, geodatabase, etc. Relational databases like Oracle, SQL Server, IBM DB2. And then web-based services like ArcGIS Server or OGZ Web Services. But many other formats are not supported. So what do? The plugin data source extensibility pattern is used to integrate those unsupported formats. Like, for example, unsupported relational databases such as MySQL, or non-relational databases such as MongoDB, and then many other proprietary or obscure file-based data stores or web services. So within the plugin data source framework, you can show custom data as a feature class or as a standalone table. So in essence, features and rows are supported. So raster and such is not supported, but features and rows are supported. You can consume any format and data source, so files, databases, or web services. All is possible using plugin data sources. There are some limitations for plugin data sources. So for example, access in Pro is read-only. You cannot write back to a plugin data source. Access is always in form of tables and feature classes. So like I said, no raster or anything like that. And also, your access should always start file-based, meaning it starts with some type of file or folder. So your custom source is either a file or a folder, or your connection file to your custom data source is a file. And you can see that in all our examples. Imagine, for example, your access to SQL Server or any kind of custom database is always going through a .sde file. So you would have a similar kind of configuration file that you would use to configure your web service or your relational database connection. So here we have a high-level access objects overview in ArcGIS Pro. We start at the very top with a connector. A connector defines a connection to a data source. And a connector is used to create or open a data store. A data store is a specific instance of a data source, and a data store is used to open one or more tables or feature classes. And then tables or feature classes contain data rows, and data rows can be queried or return a cursor. So cursors can be used to iterate through all the data rows. So that is the hierarchy on a kind of a 10,000-foot level that we use within ArcGIS Pro. So the ArcGIS Pro plugin project template is used to start a new plugin data source project. It will stop out all the code for you. similar to what you've seen Uma show us before. And we'll see that shortly. We have project templates for all our major extensibility patterns. So what it does, it creates three concrete classes that inherit from API classes. And these API classes used for the plugin data source are the plugin data source template, which is used to manage one or more tables or feature classes, the plugin table template, which can be queried and returns a cursor, or plugin cursor template, where data rows are returned by iterating using that cursor. So also, in addition to implementing these concrete classes, you have to make an update to the config.daml to register your plugin data source with ArcGIS Pro. And below you see a little snippet on how you do that. Within ArcGIS Pro tag, we have a plugin data sources tag, and I have my new plugin data source that I specify by ID, and then I reference the class for the data source template that actually implements it. So next demo, we're going to show how to use a data source template. So I'm going to go to Visual Studio 2019. I specify file new project to create a new project. And I simply click on ArcGIS Pro plugin. You know, I can filter like Uma showed us earlier. I can filter to ArcGIS Pro. That just makes it easier for me to find what I want to do in my workflow. So I select that. I give it a name. I just keep the name that it stubbed out for me, and I create it. So now it will actually stub out all the code and also enhance the config.daml. So you can see the config.daml was updated. It has the reference to my new plugin data source. Here is my plugin data source ID, and then the class reference. And you can see that in the code behind, 3 classes were implemented. I have the concrete implementation for my plugin data source template. I have a concrete implementation for my table template. And I have the concrete implementation for my cursor template. Now, in addition to getting the concrete implementations, you get a list of overrides where you have to now provide your content to support your data source. So this is not an easy task, and I cannot show you in the context of this demo what you all need to do. So I would recommend that you go to the community samples, look through the community samples, and see how all the content is filled in. It's not really that difficult. You will see that right away. A lot of the content you can copy and paste too. So let me close this. We don't need this anymore. Back to the slides. So here's some examples of custom data sources that I'm going to use in the upcoming demos. So first, we have the JPEG photos with the GPS metadata. So you know that smartphones and digital cameras have an option to capture GPS information when you take a picture. Now we have written a plugin data source that looks at this as a custom data source, extracts the GPS data, puts a point and a photo on a map. So that's the first one. The second one is a GPX file. GPX is the GPS exchange format that's used by many GPS tracking devices, such as your Garmin device, to exchange tracking information about your hike or your drive or whatever you're tracking. And then finally, I'm going to show you a little demo using SQL Server Express. SQL Server Express is a version of Microsoft SQL Server that's kind of free download and free use. It's somewhat limited, but it just shows you how you can implement a connection to relational database data source. And what I did is I just copied data from a classic personal geodatabase some of you who used ArcMap will probably know what that is, into my SQL Server database just to have some custom data format within that database. And these samples are all available under the community samples. So feel free to see what's going on there. So here again, a little summary of what I did with the SQL Server Express data, that you can download that data sample from our community samples. In essence, I copied the data from a classic personal geodatabase into SQL Server. SQL Server has little wizards that help you to do that. I copied all tables and feature classes from the data source, and then I also copied some of the metadata, mainly the GDB underscore geocom, geometry columns, items, and spatial references, just so I have all the metadata I need to show this old data format through my plugin data source. You'll see that in the demo that's coming up next. So how do you now use a custom plugin data source? We learned how to define a plugin data source, but now how do you use one? How do you get your plugin data onto a map? And the way you do this is you define a connection to a data source instance, and you use data source connection path for that. And then you use the connection to create a data store to your data source instance. And then you use the data store to access tables and feature classes. It sounds complicated, but when you look at the code snippet below, it is actually very easy to comprehend. So first, I have my data source connection path here. It needs two items. Number one is the name of my plugin data source, and number two is a path to my data source connection file or to my data source file, depending on what I'm looking at. Now, once I have the connection, I can now create an instance of a data store using new plugin data store, passing in the connection. And then using that instance of the data store, I can retrieve all table names. And then using the table names, I can call open table on my instance of the plugin data store. And open table will return back to me either a feature class or a table. Now in this case, I say as feature class. Clearly this sample wouldn't work for tables, it will only work for feature classes. But once I retrieve the feature class from open table, I can now use the layer factory to create the feature layer and add it to the map. So that brings me to this demo. So when we look at the sample, we can see, so this is the SQL Express reader sample from community samples. I define a plugin data source for this, including the plugin data source template that gets overwritten. All this is stubbed out for me. I just had to fill in the content. Important here is that the open method always gets a path, a file path. That's very important. So if you want to pack additional information to the end of the path, you always should use the pipe character, because path is tolerant to the pipe character, but not to any other special characters like semicolon, etc. If you know, for example, if you open a file geodatabase, you know that the first part of the file geodatabase would be the path to the folder, and then any additional information would be the specific feature class or table you want to deal with. So this is why we use a pipe character here. So finally, let's see, we have a third concrete class that we implement, which is the plugin table template. And here it's important to realize that you have to implement or override the search functionality that that your table has to support, in both that you have to handle spatial and also tabular where clauses. Now, when you access a SQL type relational database, where clause handling for tabular access is very easy to do. The way I handle spatial access is I always retrieve the data first using the tabular where clause. I convert the spatial data into compatible data in ArcGIS Pro, and then I use ArcGIS Pro's geometry API to do the spatial filtering second. So that's kind of important. And you see that in the example because we support both. And then also kind of a point of interest here. So we use the classic personal geodatabase. We have to convert the personal geodatabase geometry into a pro geometry. So that's kind of done here in this little routine. So I convert all the geometries when they come in from the data source into compatible geometries in ArcGIS Pro. And now finally, here's the code where we actually consuming the plugin data source. And I'm going to step through that real quick. So we'll start the Visual Studio in Debugger. We're going to open a project. And then I'm going to step through this kind of code, and we programmatically add the plugin data source to our map. So the data within the plugin data source. So here we go. The button for the code behind is under the Demo 1 tab. So let me click this tab. Click here. So here's our path. You can see the path. So this is kind of the custom format I talked about before. You have a path for a file, and then I have some pipe characters. And as you can see, here's my connection information to my SQL Server data. So this is kind of proprietary to my interface, but my interface knows how to parse that in the plugin data source connection. So I have my plugin data source connection path. I create an instance of my plugin data store. Now I have an instance of the plugin data store. Now I'm going to get my table names, and we're just going to look at the first table name here. So the first table name is airports. So needless to say, it's going to go through all the tables here, and then depending on the type, whether it's feature class, I use create feature layer to add it to the current map. Or if it's not feature class, I use create standalone table to add it to the map as a standalone table. So let me continue running this. And now you can see on the right side the various classes, points, lines, and polygons were added to my map. You can see the name has a little slash in front of it. It's actually a bug that I coded in, but I just left it because this way we can easily see what's coming from our plugin data source. So here's the airport that we initially first added. It went to the bottom, and then the later feature classes came in, went on top. So because this is a real feature class, we can actually look at the attributes of this information. So I can right-click and view the attributes. I can look at the names. I can select them. I can zoom to them. I can identify them. So anything you can do with a feature class, you can do with your plugin data source data, including I can label this if I want to, and you can see the Shasta label appearing. So I just now labeled my volcanoes. So so this is a quick overview over how you create a plugin data source and then how you consume it. So needless to say, this is not how you want to present an implementation to your users. You want to implement a much better user experience, And what you want to do is include your custom content integrated both in the catalog and its browse experience, as you can see on the little screenshot on the right. And in order to do this, you have to use what we call a custom project item template. And this is something where we have plenty of samples. And we also have some guides on this, some pro guides that will help you through this. It's not a trivial implementation, but it's very, very powerful in terms of integration. So in essence, you're pairing a custom item with a plugin data source, and that allows your custom content to be integrated into the Pro catalog and also the open file dialog. And that brings us to the last demo here. And as a matter of fact, I should have just left that running. I'm gonna show you that same SQL Server sample again, because I also implemented a custom project item that works in tandem with this DataSource plugin. So what we can see here, if I now browse through the folders, we have a little folder called SQL Express data. Once I drill into that SQL Express folder, and you can see here, this is my SQL Express connection file. You can see there's two databases in here, the FD test SQL Express and then a test SQL. And when you open it, you can see, oh, I have a feature data set in here called USA, and I have cities, counties, states. So we could, for example, add the states to my map. So this is fully integrated now. I can also do this from within a open item dialog box, and I can drill down in here as well. So I can go to my test SQL Express database, and I can add my golf courses if I would want to. And now you can see my golf courses, right? And one advantage is now I can, if I would want to, add the whole database to this by just saying add the whole database, and then it will actually loop through and iterate through all the content and add it to my map. So this for the SQL experience and the implementation and the sample. Finally, I'm going to show you one last example here, which is the Pro Data Reader, again from Community Samples. I implemented two plugin data sources here, one for the JPEG imagery and one for the GPX file format. And let's build this, and then we run it real quick, and that will finish our presentation. So let's see, start. Okay, here we go. And again, if you have similar formats, I would recommend go to the samples and copy as much as you can of the content from there. It will make your life a lot easier. Okay, so now I can go to my folder here, and I have, this is my little connection file to my custom data. And eventually yes, here we go. So now I can look at this data source. This is a GPX file. I can right click on this. I can add it to the data. I can also drill down to the points, and then you can see here, this data source, actually a GPX file, resulted in both lines and points. And again, I can add the attribute table here to look at the attributes. So we can see this was created via Garmin Connect. There's some additional information in here. And I can also look at my pictures. I can look at my JPEGs that are geocoded. And a few years ago, I was at NASA in Florida. So let me add that image to the map. It will add a point to the map in Florida. I can zoom to that point. I can now identify that point, and I can look at the photo that I took way back then at NASA. So you can see that not treated as a regular raster image, but instead treated as a geocoded GPS photo. And that brings me back to the slides. So if you're interested in some of the materials we've shown you here, you can use this QR code or the link here to get to the sites and download that material. And we thank you for listening to us. Goodbye. Hopefully we'll see you at the next Developer Summit. Thank you.